on the two opening cantos of Savitri. The Symboldawn. It was the hour before the gods awake. Mother. There is an ancient tradition which describes the creation as done by some first emanations of the Supreme Mother, who were four emanations. In the sense and the feeling of their supreme power, they cut connection with their origin and became independent. And then these emanations, being separated from their origin, entered into darkness. The first was consciousness, consciousness in light. And by cutting himself from his origin, he went down and down towards unconsciousness. The second was bliss and turned into suffering. The third was truth and turned into falsehood. The fourth one was life and turned into death. This happened after they came into the vital level. When this was seen, it was decided that the second emanations would be made to repair the mistake of the first. And the second emanations were the gods. The first line refers to the condition of the world before the gods were born. Sri Aurobindo says it was the hour before the gods awake. From another conversation dated 27th January 1962. But I also remember reading the tradition before I met Sri Aurobindo. It was like a novel, a serialized romance of the world's creation. But it was very evocative. Theon called it the tradition. That was where I first learned of the Universal Mother's first four emanations, when the Lord delegated his creative power to the Mother, and it was identical to the ancient Indian tradition, but told like a nursery story. Anyone could understand. It was an image, like a movie, and very vivid. So she made her first four emanations. The first was consciousness and light, arising from Satchidananda. The second was Ananda and love. The third was life, and truth was the fourth. Then, so the story goes, conscious of their infinite power, instead of keeping their connection with the Supreme Mother and through her with the Supreme, instead of receiving indications for action from him and doing things in proper order, they were conscious of their own power, and each one took off independently to do as he pleased. They had power, and they used it. They forgot their origin. And because of this initial oblivion, consciousness became unconsciousness, and light became darkness, Ananda became suffering, love became hate, life became death, and truth became falsehood. And they were instantly thrown headlong into what became matter. According to Theon, the world as we know it is the result of that. And that was the Supreme himself in his first manifestation. But the story is easy to understand and quite evocative. On the surface, for intellectuals, it's very childish. But once you have the experience, you understand it very well. I understood and felt the thing immediately. And once the world has become like that, has become the vital world in all its darkness, and they, from this vital world, have created matter, the Supreme Mother sees, laughing, the result of her first 4 emanations. And she turns towards the Supreme in a great entreaty. Now that this world is in such a dreadful state, it has to be saved. We can't just leave it this way, can we? It has to be saved. The divine consciousness must be given back to it. What to do? And the Supreme says, thrust yourself into a new emanation, an emanation of the essence of love, down into the most material matter. That meant plunging into the earth. The earth had become a symbol and a representation of the whole drama. Plunge into matter. So she plunged into matter. And that became the primordial source of the divine within material substance. And from there, as is so well described in Savitri, she begins to act as a leaven in matter, raising it up from within. And as she plunged into the earth, a second series of emanations was sent forth, the gods, to inhabit the intermediary zones between Satchitananda and the earth. And these gods, laughing, well, great care was taken to make them perfect, so they wouldn't give any trouble. But they are a bit too perfect, aren't they? Yes, a bit too perfect. They never make mistakes. They always do exactly as they're told. In short, rather lacking in initiative. They do have some, but in fact, they were not surrendered in the way a psychic being can be, because they had no psychic in them. The psychic being is the result of the descent. Only human beings have it. And that's what makes humanity so superior to the gods. Theon insisted greatly on this. Throughout his story, humans are far superior to gods and should not obey them. They should only be in contact with the Supreme in his aspect of perfect love. I don't know how to put it. To me, these gods always seemed, not those described in the Puranas, they're different. Well, not so very different. But the way Theon presented them, they seemed just like a bunch of marshmallows. It's not that they had no power. They had a lot of power, but they lacked that psychic flame. And to Theon, the God of the Jews and Christians was an Asura. This Asura wanted to be unique, and so he became the most terrible despot imaginable. Anatole France said the same thing. I now know that Anatole France had never read Theon's story, but I can't imagine where he picked this up. It's in the Revolt of the Angels. He says that Satan is the true God, and that Jehovah, the only God, is the monster. And when the angels wanted Satan to become the one and only God, Satan realized he was immediately taking on all Jehovah's failings. So he refused. Oh no, thank you very much. It's a wonderful story. And in exactly the same spirit as what Theon used to say. The very first thing I asked Anatole France, I told you I met him once, mutual friends introduced us. The first thing I asked him was, have you ever read the tradition? He said no. I explained why I had asked, and he was interested. He said his source was his own imagination. He had caught that idea intuitively. Well, if you speak this way to philosophers and metaphysicians, they'll look at you as if to say, you must be a real simpleton to believe all that claptrap. But these things are not to be taken as concrete truths. They are simply splendid images. Through them, I really did come in contact, very concretely, with the truth of what caused the world's distortion. Much better than with all the Hindu stories, far more easily. Buddhism and all similar lines of thought took the shortest path. The desire to exist is what has caused all the trouble. If the Lord had refrained from having this desire, there would have been no world. It's childish, very childish, really a much too human way of looking at the problem. To see it from the angle of delight of being is qualitatively far superior. But then there's still the problem of why it all became the way it is. The usual reply is because all things were possible, and this is one possibility. But it's not a very satisfying feeling. Yes, all right, that's just the way it is. It's a fact. People used to ask Theon too, why did it happen like this? Why? Wait till you get to the other side, then you will know. And meanwhile, do what's necessary to get there. That's the most urgent thing. But there is one advantage. Without those beings, without the world's distortion, many things would be lacking. Those beings potentially embodied certain absolutely unique elements. Understandably so, since they were the first wave, and precisely because they still were the Supreme to such a great extent, each one felt he was the Supreme, and that was that. Only it wasn't quite sufficient, for the simple reason that they were already divided into four, and one single division is enough to make everything go wrong. It's readily understandable. It's not something essentially evil, but a question of wrong functioning. It's not the substance, not the essence. The essence isn't evil, but the functioning is faulty. Across the path of the divine event, the huge, foreboding mind of night, alone in her unlit temple of eternity, lay stretched immobile upon silence march. Almost one felt opaque, impenetrable, in the somber symbol of her eyeless muse, the abysm of the unbodied infinite. A fathomless zero occupied the world. As a result of this separation between the first emanations and the origin, the creation by these first emanations had become obscure, inconscient. And that is what Sri Aurobindo describes here. He says, the divine event, that is creation. Creation that will go on and on for eternity. It started with what he called the night of a foreboding mind. It is unconscious, immobile, lifeless, blind. All these things, the obscurity and the unconsciousness, the immobility, lifelessness, the unbodied infinite, and a fathomless zero, all these words are meant to express the nothingness of the world. A power of fallen, boundless self, awake between the first and the last nothingness, recalling the tenebrous womb from which it came, turned from the insoluble mystery of birth and the tardy process of mortality, and longed to reach its end in vacant naught. Even in the darkest unconscious, there was something like the remembrance of the divine origin, and it had an urge to wake up to existence. But all the habit of the inconscient was so strong that it had a natural tendency to go back to nothingness. It is just what preceded the beginning of a conscious creation in the world. We saw that this emanation of light and consciousness had separated from its origin and had naturally fallen into inconscience. The result was that the world created was the world of unconsciousness, a world of nothingness, of obscure nothingness. But in spite of everything, the divine origin was inside this and had an urge to bring up again a world of consciousness. And this is like the first attempt of waking up in the nothingness by something that was the faint expression of the consciousness, but recalling, as Sri Aurobindo says, the tenebrous womb from which it came. This had a tendency of going back to the unconsciousness. It is like the origin of death. As in a dark beginning of all things, a mute, featureless semblance of the unknown, repeating forever the unconscious act, prolonging forever the unseeing will, cradled the cosmic drowse of ignorant force, whose moved creative slumber kindles the suns and carries our lives in its somnambulist whirl. Athwart the vain, enormous trance of space, its formless stupor without mind or life, a shadow spinning through a soulless void, thrown back once more into unthinking dreams, earth wheeled abandoned in the hollow gulfs, forgetful of her spirit and her fate. For the sake of evolution and the ascension towards consciousness, Earth was formed, but it was formed naturally in the unconscious. And so, Sri Aurobindo says, athwart the vain, enormous trance of space, its formless stupor without mind or life, a shadow spinning through a soulless void, thrown back once more into unthinking dreams, earth wheeled abandoned in the hollow gulfs, forgetful of her spirit and her fate. That is when the earth was created in the unconscious and the nothingness, in order to concentrate the effort and the working of evolution. That is the description of the beginning. Earth began almost totally unconscious, as he says, forgetful of her spirit and her fate. That is the beginning.